Hey guys, what's up? It's Castro here. So let's take a look at chapter 25. Just taking a look at some of the last things in there, right? So we're going to take a look at the effects of industrialization on the cities. And so this idea of urbanization, right? So the growth of cities. One of the things that we see is that during this time period, the population will double. A lot of it has to do with the new immigrants. City populations will triple. We will see the growth of the skyscrapers. The very first one opens up in Chicago in 1885. We will see the introduction of the electric trolley. That's going to be really important in terms of inner city transportation, but also the opening up of eventually of suburbs, right? People being able to travel to the outside of the city. The introduction of the department store, the effects that has in terms of instantly being able to purchase ready-made goods. Jobs for women in terms of the department stores. One of the negative effects of this change will be the unsanitary conditions of the cities. Think about today, right? The things that we take for granted in terms of the, like things like the sewer system and things like that, right? Garbage disposal. The cities didn't have those things, right? So we also see the rise of criminal activity. The growth of tenements, and so these apartment buildings where poor people lived, sometimes anywhere between 10 to 15 people in a really cramped up room, no air conditioning during the summers, and then no heating during the winters. And so the effects that would have on some people were awful in terms of the living conditions. And so we begin to see the development of slums. And like I said, one of the things that we'll see too is the introduction of the suburb. So just something to think about. So one of the things, like I said, was that immigration is going to play a huge role, right? So from 1607 to 1880, a lot of the immigration came from Western Europe. So we talked a lot about this, right? So mostly, places like Germany, places like Ireland, England, Scotland, Scandinavia. Between 1880 and 1914, an estimated 25 million people, right, moved to the United States from Eastern and Southern Europe and, of course, Asia. It is the largest mass movement of people to another place in terms of human history. So one of the things that I want to have a conversation a little bit about in class is what were some of the push and pull factors that will lead to industrialization. And also how those push and pull factors, right, in terms of immigration. We'll also talk about the idea of birds of passage versus settlements, and then how this immigration will lead to the development of boroughs, right? Things like Little Italy, Little Poland, Little Portugal, Irish Town, right? So just something to talk about, right? Like why these boroughs developed. So one of the things that we'll see is that the federal government will do little to help with this quote-unquote assimilation, right, or the blending of people. And so one of the things, again, that we want to discuss is this idea of, salad bowl versus melting pot. And, the growing occurrence of nativism. So local political machines like Boss Tweed will take advantage of the immigrant needs. However, during this time period, we will also see an incredible human development happen in terms of movement, and it's what's called the social gospel movement. So people were attending church, very similar to the Second Great Awakening. You can make the argument that this is almost a Third Great Awakening, but it isn't so much a movement to open up more churches, but it was more about following in the footsteps of Jesus, this social gospel movement. The social gospel movement, this idea that, again, to go out and do God's work, will lead to the movement called the settlement house movement, where people began to open up settlement houses, or as we may call them, essentially just like homeless shelters, right, if you may, but maybe like places where people can become educated, or, other things like that are going to help them. One of the most famous settlement house movement people is one of my heroes, a woman by the name of Jane Addams. You see a picture of her here. She was a middle-class American woman who had saved up some money, and she was heavily affected by the things that she was seeing in Chicago in terms of the slums and the ills of society. And so she took her money and she purchased a rundown mansion called Hull House, and she essentially rebuilt it, and she turned it into a settlement house, and she devoted essentially the rest of her life to helping inner city people, especially young children, to learn to read and write, feed them, take care of them. An incredible woman, and she became essentially a huge hero to a lot of inner city people in Chicago. And it was definitely spit in the face of ideas like social Darwinism and social gospel, right? That, essentially that, poor people are, meant to be poor, and that's it, right? It's kind of their fault. Where Jane Addams is going to say, well, no, right? Like, everybody deserves a little bit of help. So very, very different in terms of the quote-unquote philanthropy, right, between like her and maybe like, someone like Carnegie or Rockefeller. Like I said, one of the things that we'll see, right, is increased nativism during this time. And the idea was that the nativism would be towards the darker-skinned Europeans. So many of the Europeans, many of the people that were already living here are going to say, right, that the new immigrants were blamed for the urban decay, that it was their lifestyle, their culture, right? I mean, some of the things that we see now, right? You hear people say things like, like in the area we live in, right? The Indians, right? The Chinese, the Vietnamese, the Mexicans, right? Essentially changing the area that we live in and their culture, right? And like, just some of the things, so maybe in class we could even discuss, like, what are some of the things that are said today that are very nativist, right, that maybe we don't think about, and maybe we should challenge, our family members, our friends, right, in terms of some of the things that we say, and maybe some of the things that we hear. So one of the things that we'll see is the rise of an American nativist organization called the American Protective Society. And they were very much nativists, people who were also labor leaders because they feared that the immigrants would come in and take some of these jobs. And so they were also advocates of literacy exams, right? Because if you can't read and write in English, then you shouldn't be able to do some of the things that Native Americans, right, in this case, like native as in like people who've lived here, can do. We will also see the development of what is called the Americanization movement, where some people said, okay, well, fine, the immigrants are here, let's Americanize them, let's help them assimilate. So it wasn't so much about like, let's help them, come into American culture, and let's accept, let's learn about them, but it was more about let's help them shed their immigrant blankets, if you may, or clothes and rags, right, and become more American. Interestingly enough, right, the French people gave us the Statue of Liberty in 1886, and on the Statue of Liberty, right, there's the Emma Lazarus poem, which reads, "Give me your tired, your poorly rested, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe outside air, the wretched refuse of your teeming sore backs. Send these not the often home, tempest tossed to me, I lift my lamp beside the golden epic door." So the irony, right, that we get this gift from the French people. The Statue of Liberty herself is an immigrant, right? And the French people give us this gift because of what our country sort of embodies, this idea of freedom, right, and liberty and acceptance, right, and people wanting to come here because of these reasons. And yet the irony, of course, right, the paradox is that we began shifting towards an anti-immigrant policy. One of the things that also becomes really important during this time is we will begin to see an incredible rise in the importance of science and how science is going to come to challenge religion. And we're going to talk more and more about this. And it's one of these conversations that I wish we had more time to actually jump into because I think it's really, really important. But one of the things that kind of gets that started, of course, is the publishing of On the Origin of Species in 1859 by Charles Darwin. So one of the things that we'll talk a little bit about in class is the argument of evolution versus creationism, right? Science versus religion, or modernist versus fundamentalism in terms of religious thought. And this is, of course, is going to lead to the evolution of science in schools. We're also going to see during this time the rise in sort of education and the coming into the forefront of African American leaders. A lot of credit is given to people like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, right, for sort of starting that civil rights movement. But you can go back even further with people like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, and these two men are going to be really important for the emergence of modern America, especially for black people. Booker T. Washington was an ex-slave. Again, he's from the South. It's all about perspective too, right? But he's from the South, and he was one of the founders of a very important university called the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. And he wanted to teach African Americans trades and vocations. And one of the things that he advocated for was, he said that African Americans should learn a trade, and that they needed to be able to gain economic independence, that they needed to be able to do other things besides farm. And so once African Americans would be able to gain some economic independence, that through this economic independence, they may actually gain some respect from their white counterparts socially, and maybe as a result they would get political rights. One of his more famous students is someone by the name, of course, of George Washington Carver, who many of you know because of peanut butter. We could talk a little bit about him also in the class. He's a person who living at the same time, right, but having maybe a different view, is a guy by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois, right? So he is a Northern Free Black. He is the first African American to earn a PhD from Harvard University in Boston. He demanded, unlike Booker T. Washington, who said that African Americans needed economic viability and freedom first, he said, how can African Americans ever gain any type of economic viability and freedom and equality if they have no social, right, and political equality that has been granted to them? So he said that what needed to be done first was African Americans needed to be treated as equal socially, and the only way to do that is to be able to be treated politically equally. And as a result of that, whites would have no choice but to give them economic freedom and to be able to, essentially give them those opportunities. He eventually is the founder of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And one of the things that he talked about was something called the talented tenth that I want to talk a little bit about in class. So, growth of higher education, right? So we'll see increase in universities following the Civil War. Vassar College in New York, one of the first universities for women. Howard University, one of the first colored universities. One of the most liberal, still considered one of the most liberal schools in the country, Oberlin College. And then one of the things that we'll see too is that the federal government will pass what is called the Morrill Act of 1862. It was provided grants for state-supported education, agriculture and manufacturing type schools. One of the more famous universities that comes out of this is a university called Texas A&M, right? Which stands for Texas Agricultural and Manufacturing. We'll also see the growth of literature. And again, literature tends to be very reflective of the things that were going on at the time. Some of the more famous writers during this time, a guy by the name of Horatio Alger. He wrote a book called Ragged Dick, Rags to Riches, and I'm sure some of you were chuckling when I said that right now. Emily Dickinson, she of course was a poet. Unfortunately, she was very much a recluse, introvert. Her poems were published after death. Kate Chopin, The Awakening, was about women's ambitions and how there needed to be sort of an awakening by women. Mark Twain, of course, many different books, right? Samuel Clemens, and a lot of it was about social commentary about what was happening at the time. Bret Harte, of course, wrote about the California Gold Rush. Stephen Crane, Maggie, Girl on the Street. It was about urban prostitution. If you ever get the chance to read this book, it is a tremendously sad book. Really sad. Jack London, called The Wild White Fang and Iron Heel, right, wrote a lot about the wilderness. And one of my favorite books that I read in college is a book called The Octopus. It's by a guy named Frank Norris. Incredible book also. It's about the corruption of the railroad industry during this time. Women during this time too, right? Urban life was stressful on the families. We tended to see fewer and fewer families. Urban life led to increased child labor, right? Just incredible in terms of the treatment of children during this time. We will see during this time also the growth, though, of feminism, and some of these organizations began to spring up. The National Women's Suffrage Association, the National Association of Colored Women. In 1869, women, one of the things that women began to also have a huge effect on was wanting to prohibit alcohol. And so in 1869, we get the National Prohibition Party, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, Carrie Nation. Remind me to talk a little bit about Carrie Nation in class. She was an incredibly crazy woman. The Anti-Saloon League was formed in 1893. And then the American Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, and of course the Red Cross. So a lot in terms of women during this time. And then in terms of amusement, just a few things. We begin to see amusement spring up because people had a little bit more money, maybe a little bit more luxury time. So Phineas T. Barnum and James A. Bailey, they opened up the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus. We'll see the development of the Wild West shows. Buffalo Bill Cody. Baseball begins to explode during this time. No Holds Barred Wrestling. And then also in 1891, the development of basketball. So just some of the things to think about.